Hi, everyone. Let's talk about acceptance and retention rate reporting. So as you know, as part of your reports, you need to include information on your program's acceptance and retention rates every year. We're hoping that this isn't just an idle exercise, and you shouldn't only be doing it because Healthy Families New York says that it's required. It has a few benefits for you. It gives you an annual point of reflection to take stock of what's going on at your program. Maybe it helps you see the full picture instead of the couple of most recent stories that you remember. It forces you to review your activities and see if you've made any progress over the past year. What's your acceptance rate this year compared to last year? Has it improved? Has it changed? And what are the factors that seem to be impacting your acceptance rate or your retention rate? And this thinking can guide you to make a plan to improve your acceptance or retention rate over the next year. So hopefully it's meaningful and actionable. So what do you need to do for each of these pieces? You'll use the MIS reports to measure your rates in the appropriate time period. That's usually the past year for the acceptance rate and the 13 to 24 months past for that retention rate. You'll analyze by determining what factors impact your rates. So who's enrolling or staying versus who's not enrolling or staying, and why do you think that might be? And then you'll develop and hopefully implement a plan based on the factors identified in your analysis. And you'll look back at the effectiveness of previous strategies. What was last year's plan? Are you doing better in those categories where you maybe weren't as enrolling as many people? Or has that factor remained about the same? And today we're going to focus more on that MIS and analysis piece, what you need to run the MIS reports and how to interpret the results to perform your analyses and answer those critical questions. All right, so what do you need in your analyses? What kind of information, what sources? Well, first, you need formal and informal data. Formal, as in numbers and percentages, my favorite, I'm very biased here. And you need, again, both the numbers and the percentages. Why do you need both? Well, the percentage gives the rate, but saying 100% of people were enrolled means really different things if it's 100% of 2 people or if it's 100% of 100 people. Did you end up with 2 people or did you end up with 100? So you need the context of who your full group is. And same if you say, we enrolled 10 people, cool, 10 out of 100, that's not a great rate. If it's a 10 out of 15 people, that's a pretty good rate. So you need both those pieces of information. Informal data is going to come from discussions and conversations with your staff, with your advisory board, with other stakeholders. This is going to hopefully complement that formal information. Now, critically, both of these are important. We're only talking about formal data today because that's the kind of data that's in the MIS. But the MIS doesn't capture everything. We of course would always like to have more data in the MIS, but we also know there's a limit of what is reasonable to ask everyone to report. So there are factors that might matter to your program or to your community that aren't part of the MIS data. Maybe family religion is a big part of your acceptance rate, where people from one religious group are really likely to enroll and accept services or to stay retained, and people from another group aren't as likely. That's going to matter for your program and for your plan and the services you provide, but it's not part of the MIS. So again, we're focusing on the MIS because that's what we have today, but these other factors, this informal data, is also going to be really important. So when you're looking at all of this information, you can think about it as 3 subtypes: demographic, programmatic, and social. So under the 8th edition best practice standards, you need to discuss the impact of at least one factor on your acceptance rate or your retention rate for a rating of a 2. You need to discuss at least 3 factors for a rating of a 3. So let's define those 3 categories more specifically. Demographic data is going to tell you about general population characteristics. So take a second, think about what demographic data could be. So maybe demographic data is something about the age of your participants. Maybe it's their race or their ethnicity. Maybe it's a language that they speak. Maybe it's their income. Maybe it's their location. Obviously, you'll know if they're in or out of your program's catchment area, but maybe there's a town or a zip code or a neighborhood subdivision that's meaningful. That piece isn't going to be the MIS. But again, that doesn't mean it's not meaningful. It's still demographic data. It's just not going to be recorded in those subdivisions and analyzable in the MIS in the same way, but you can still get at that through that informal conversation and informal data piece. All right, let's think about programmatic for a second. Programmatic data is going to be general site-related factors that impact service planning and delivery. So this is what your program is doing. So think for a second about what a programmatic factor that you could look at would be. The programmatic factors might include who the worker was who worked with that family. Maybe it's generally, is your program down on staff, and that's having a big impact on your acceptance or your retention rate. Maybe it's the service level that a family is at. Maybe it's the referral source that they came from, or maybe you have some policies from your agency or at your program that are impacting your rates. And finally, social factors are related to family support networks, to family relationships, and to families' communities. So think for a second about what a social factor could be at your program. So social factors might be your FROG score or your current issues, PC1 current issues. So things like domestic or intimate partner violence, substance use, mental health difficulties, developmental disabilities. Religion, again, might be a social factor that relates to a family support network or community. Maybe there are work or school issues. Maybe it's something about the family's makeup or the type of family community. If it's a grand family, if it's an LGBTQ family. So again, the ones with question marks aren't really in the MIS. Again, that doesn't mean they're not important. It just means you need to get at them through other data sources. So again, you need formal and informal data. You have demographic, programmatic, and social factors, but you also need a couple other pieces. You need to compare, to look at the reasons for a refusal or discharge. So is there something consistent that's coming up as the reason people are being discharged from your program? So is there something about everyone saying it's work or school issues and they can't make the visits work because of the timing they need to be at? Well, that might give you what you need to go to your agency and say, we need flexibility in work hours because we can't serve families during the workday because that's when they're also working. So that can be, oh, I've identified this factor that's impacting my rates. Here's a plan to do something about it. All right, let's see if my rates get better next year if I'm able to implement that plan. Then you also need to compare those who accept to those who refuse, or those who continue are retained to those who are discharged. So, for example, it's not enough to say that you have lots of single moms who are enrolling or staying enrolled. Great, good for you. You also need to say, are single moms enrolling or staying enrolled at a higher rate than married moms? That says, all right, there's some difference between these groups that's leading to a difference in rate. And so maybe, is there something I can do for married moms that will make them more likely to see the program as a value add that they want to be part of or be able to stay enrolled in the program? So again, think about this. You want to identify factors to make a plan to address them. If single moms have a really high enrollment rate, but it's not better than any other marital status mom, well, there's no plan to make off of that other than what can I generally do to make everyone want to stay more? So you can also compare back to the previous year. Have my results, are the factors that I'm identifying consistent with previous, or are they different at this point in time and moving forward? So then you write a narrative that includes all of this. You can't just dump in some numbers and say you've done it. You write a narrative that includes this data and says, all right, what are the patterns and trends that I see? Is there anything expected or unexpected? Do my formal and informal data match up with each other? Are they telling me different things? And then think about what can I use from this to make a plan moving forward. All right. So we're going to get back to those two reports, the acceptance and retention rate reports. And again, when we're looking at these reports, we want to determine impact. Where are two groups different in their rates that might make me think about how I could make a plan to address it moving forward. That also means we want to think about what's worth addressing. We don't want to make an entire plan based on what comes down to two people that I might get. Hey, if you can get those two people, great. But you don't want to shape your program's entire plan for the next year on how to get those two people. So let's think for a second about where it's worth it, where there's a big enough difference that's probably worth writing about, maybe making a plan about, or at least noticing. So I think about it as an impact is potentially worth noting when there's, let's say, at least a 10 percentage point difference between subgroups, and there's at least 10 cases in each subgroup. So that helps me feel like, okay, there's enough people here that if I got all of those people, it would end up making a substantial impact on my acceptance rate or my retention rate, and it would be meaningful, so it's worth making a plan around. So we can keep that 10 number guideline in mind as we look at the reports. So let's go ahead and start off with the acceptance rate report. The reporting time period is usually the past year. You can always run it for shorter periods if you need, but for this annual reporting, you're usually looking at the past year. But this year we had a shift to one-step processes on November 15th. So you're going to want to run your two-step acceptance rate report from the start of your contract year through November 14th, and then run the one-step report from November 15th to the end of your contract year. And you'll perform parallel analyses for each report. Now, you should expect that your acceptance rates will be hugely different between these two reports. That's okay, and we're going to talk about why in just a moment. But these are the time periods for this particular reporting year that you need to keep in mind. It's the before versus after one step. Yes, this is annoying for this year. This hopefully will be the only year where you have this split, and then we'll just move forward into one-step land in the future, and you won't have to go back to the two-step report and perform these separate analyses. The transition year is always weird and always a little harder, but hopefully in the future, this will be simpler and go back to being, okay, I just have to look at one report here. And again, you're not going to try to make the two line up with each other. We have pretty different information between the two reports. So it's going to be separate parallel analyses using November 15th as the breakpoint in timing. All right, so why are these two reports so different? Well, as you know, under our previous two-step processes, we were looking at the conversion from assessment to home visit. And our acceptance rates were often above 75%. But for one step, we're looking at the conversion from screen, not assessment, not a couple steps down the line, but from screen to enrollment and first home visit. So we're starting with a much wider pool, everyone who has a screen, and says, all right, who makes it all the way to enroll and have a first home visit versus, okay, who's already made it through screening and has been willing to talk to me, and we've set up an assessment and we've gotten a positive assessment, and now they're also willing to go into first home visits. That's a much smaller pool of people. So now we're going from screen all the way to first home visit. And our acceptance rate is going to be more around 20%. So I just want to emphasize it's a much lower percentage. We're expecting that. It's totally okay. It's going to be something for you to get used to because it's probably very different than what you're used to seeing. But we know that many screens don't go anywhere. It's okay. But we want to follow HFA's definitions of these time points. And so that's the flow that we're looking at now. And on that second point, we have a lot fewer factors available for analysis. We don't know a ton about people as of screen. We only want to use here what's collected at screen because that's what we have for everyone. If you enroll, we collect more information at baseline, at assessment, etc. But not everyone enrolls, so we can't rely on that stage. So here's what we have as of screen, as of the beginning. We have, if you end up discharging, why? That's one of the factors that we need to look at. We have the screening risk factors. We have a couple of other demographic items, PC1 age, gender, relation to TC, primary language. And then we've got a couple of programmatic factors. Where's the referral source, the trimester at screen, and then soon you'll be able to filter and run the report also by worker, and that's also programmatic. So as you can see, we don't have any social factors in the MIS as of screen. You might have other information that's from informal means that are social. That's great, but this is what we've got in the MIS. All right, so now let's take a look at how the new acceptance rate report, the one-step acceptance rate report, is laid out. Very similar to before, but a couple of things to note. So first, who's included? We're looking at positive screens, again, starting with that really wide pool with an outcome in the period. So we're not looking at anyone who has a positive screen and they just haven't fully made it through the process. We're looking at positive screens who have either gotten home visits, who have enrolled or not, or who have discharged. In this case, in the past year. And then we've got these major summary categories. We have the total families in the cohort broken down into our three outcomes of accepted, which is they have enrolled, they have an intake date, they've signed the paperwork, and they've had a first home visit. So they've got at least one home visit log. Could be a frog visit, could be a not frog home visit. We have this not accepted services, enrolled and discharged without a first home visit category. This probably isn't very many people, but it's important to separate them out. They sign the paperwork, but they don't have any home visits and have discharged. And then not accepted, did not enroll. So this is discharged without enrolling. So I think accepted with a home visit is pretty clear. Did not enroll is pretty clear. I know we have some questions about that middle category of enrolled and discharged without a first home visit. So here's a little bit more on the difference, at least between those first two categories. Now, most of the time, families will probably enroll at their first home visit. So you get a referral, you sign a worker, you screen them, you talk to them, you explain healthy families, ask if the family's interested, they say yes. You set up a first home visit, a full visit, you enroll them at that visit. Great. After the visit, you fill out a case note, fill out the engagement log and say that they accepted, and you fill out a home visit log. So their enrollment date is the date of their first home visit, and you move on from there. Fantastic. But that might not always be the case. Let's say you get a referral, you talk to the family, you explain healthy families, the family says, maybe, I'm not sure. So you set up maybe a short, more informal sample visit. Or you find a time for them to stop by the Healthy Families office for a meetup so they can meet their worker, maybe face-to-face, learn a little bit more, maybe see if they hit it off and if they want to fully engage with the program. Maybe they meet you, they say, yes, I want to enroll. Cool. You do a case note saying you had a visit or family stopped by the office. Fill out the engagement log saying you had a visit and they enrolled. Great. That means they've signed the paperwork at that visit where they met you, and you've got an intake date. But you don't fill out a home visit log yet because you didn't do a full home visit, just a sample one, or just that office visit, like get to know you. Then maybe they ghost you. Maybe they change their mind. Maybe they now refuse services. So eventually you discharge them before you get to any real home visits and home visit logs. This probably doesn't happen all that often. This tends to be a pretty small category, but it is worth separating out these folks who enrolled but didn't actually receive services from the folks who never enrolled or enrolled and got services because they actually got home visits. So they have an outcome. It's just not either of those other two, but it's not very many people. So looking at the forms in the MIS, you'd go through these steps. You'd fill out a case note saying visit conducted or family came to the office and they decided to enroll. Then you'd fill out the engagement log, so it gets pre-filled with the kind of activities that are performed in that last interval based on what you have in case notes. This is saying, yep, I conducted a visit with the parent, and then the case status is they enrolled, and then I assigned a worker, and they've got an intake date, and now they've enrolled because they've signed the paperwork at our visit. And then afterwards, maybe you fill out a home visit log if you did a full visit, but also don't fill out a home visit log if it was that informal, just welcoming short sample visit, so they could just get a feel for things because they hadn't fully decided yet. All right, so that's those categories. Let's go back to our example. Let's say we have 100 potentially eligible families who had a screen in the past year. This is our wide starting pool. Of those, let's say 21 or 21%. In this case, we made the numbers and the percentages match, so it's just a little easier. 21 enrolled, accepted, and had a first home visit. They're fully in. Great. 5 enrolled and then discharged without a first home visit. So they're in that liminal space. And then 74 did not enroll. You got a screen, you couldn't get in touch with them, or they decided they didn't want healthy families. Again, 21% is our overall acceptance rate. Very different from before, but this is more like what we're expecting now. All right, so those are our overall rates. Then let's look at the factors that we have and consider, where is the acceptance rate really different from that overall 21%? So it's at least 10% higher or lower with at least 10% or with at least 10 people per group. And think about, who are you disproportionately missing out on? Are there groups where almost everyone enrolls or almost everyone doesn't enroll? Because that's probably a big enough group of people to make a plan about and have that be a factor that's really important to you. All right, so first, we can look that first column. If you look from the 100 on down, we can look at the total number of all 100 cases and their overall outcomes. So in general, most people are discharged for being non-compliant, unresponsive. That's their main discharge reason, or refused or unable to locate. And then when we look at the next column, that 21 of those who accepted, we can look at what the main discharge reasons for those are. Now, in this case, only 2 have been discharged. So this is everyone who enrolled, has had a home visit, and a couple of them may have since been discharged. That's fine. Hopefully most of them are still enrolled, but some of them may have been discharged, and that's okay. When we're looking at that last column of that 74 who never enrolled, just discharged, we want to say, all right, what are the major reasons they're discharging? And again, this is going back to probably it's non-compliant, unresponsive, they refused, or you just weren't able to find them and get in touch again. So that doesn't tell me that there's a huge amount to make a plan about or to change my program practices, but that does let me know, all right, this is, at least off the very beginning, why most people aren't enrolling in my program. All right, let's look at the screen reasons. When we look at each row, we're going to think about where the percentages are distributed, again, really differently than those overall percentages. So where's the acceptance rate? Where's that first column? Really different from 21%. So first screening risk factor is whether the expectant or new parent is under 21 years of age at the time of screen. Are they a young parent? We look under that accepted column, enrolled and has a first home visit. It's pretty much around 21%. We're not seeing a huge difference for those who are under 21%, age 21, and those who are over. It's right around 21%. So that's not a big factor that's impacting your acceptance rates. Let's look at income. All right. Again, looking at that accepted column. Okay, so under yes, 19 people, or 38% of those who accepted, said that inadequate income was a risk for them. Almost no one who accepted said that inadequate income was not a risk for them. Almost everyone who did not accept, who never enrolled, said that inadequate income was not a risk for them. So it seems like if inadequate income is not a risk for a family, they're not enrolling. So that tells me, if this were the case, I've to some extent made up this data, but if this were to be the case, it would tell me, all right, people with inadequate income are more likely to see the value of my program and to think about how it might be able to help them get in touch with resources that they might need. But if money isn't someone's issue, they're not really going for my program. So let's think about how we explain the program to folks, and make sure that it's still appealing for those where money isn't their biggest issue, where inadequate income isn't one of their biggest risk factors. Say, all right, well, the program has lots of other good things that we try to do and try to work on, which means it could still be of service to you and could still be useful. Is there a way to make this more appealing or to better explain the program to those where maybe this isn't their biggest risk factor, so that they can understand the value that it would add? When we look at prenatal care, again, if you look at that accepted column, our percentages are 18%, 18%, and 45%, which is much more than 21. And then same for not accepted. Of those with prenatal care, almost half did enroll. That's more than the overall acceptance rate. This is a small number of people. This is only 5 people for accepted, because we don't have huge numbers of people who accept, and only a couple of people for not accepted. But it makes me think, all right, if prenatal care is a risk, are they likelier to enroll? Maybe I'm doing a really good job explaining to people that, all right, one of the great things that our program can do is make sure that you're in touch with prenatal care, maybe help you find a doctor, or make sure you get some prenatal or consistent prenatal care. And people are seeing the value of that. Marital status, I'll say, not a big enough difference to really talk about. It's a small number of people, and things aren't super off of our overall acceptance rates. All right, when we look at age, we break up age into just these 4 age bands, into these 4 chunks, to make it a little bit more readable. And when we look at this, it looks like the biggest chunk to start is 21 to 29-year-olds, but the group that's most likely to accept is 30 and over. So older parents are a little more likely to enroll than younger parents. Even though they're not your biggest group to start, they're actually your most likely to enroll. Gender, no big differences, mostly because almost everyone's female. So our percentages are really skewed from the start. Almost everyone's female, almost all PC1s are moms. So for the most part, there aren't going to be huge differences here that are worth making a plan around, because our demographics are so skewed from the start. But it's still good to take a look at a review and make sure it's like, nope, this is still in line with what I expect. All right, let's take a look at primary language. I'm going to give you a moment to just look at primary language and have you figure out what the pattern or the difference here might be. Here's what I see. Families who speak English, not very likely to enroll. Almost all of the families who speak English do not accept, never enroll. But families who speak Spanish are more likely to enroll. They're more likely than average, 40% of them, as opposed to the overall 21%. Fewer of them don't enroll. So you're doing something great at getting your Spanish-speaking families to engage with the program, not so much with the English-speaking families. So again, is there a worker thing that's going on? Is there an outreach component that you've done really great outreach to Spanish-speaking communities and not so much to English-speaking communities? Are there other ways of approaching this factor that you might want to keep in mind? For referral source type, the one thing I want to point out is these 5 families who, in this made-up data, enrolled and discharged without a first home visit. All 5 of the families here who enrolled and discharged without a first home visit came referred in from CPS. This is a small number of families, but it's still noteworthy. If I were to see this pattern in someone's data, I would really think about what these families are being told about participation from their referral source. Do these families feel like, oh, I really have to sign up for this and I really have to participate, even though I might not actually be interested, but some higher authority is telling me that I should really strongly consider this program. So they sign up, but they don't actually want to do it. Of course, we want people to fully engage with and participate in the program and get services, but we also don't want people to feel like they have to because, as I know you know, this is a voluntary program. So we want to make sure that people feel comfortable saying no. So again, this isn't real data, but this is the sort of thing that might show up with a small number of people, but that might catch your eye and still might be worth thinking about. So overriding my rule of 10 from before. Trimester at screen, I'll note that a lot of your families in the 3rd trimester are not enrolling. So fewer than your average rate of families in the 3rd trimester enroll, more than your average rate of families in the 3rd trimester do not enroll. And then also, there's one family here who accepted, has a first home visit, and is an unknown trimester. So that one I actually saw in someone else's data, I didn't completely make up. So that's something to just keep an eye out for when you see that show up in the report. Try to trace down, all right, how did this end up happening? How did I have a family who enrolled and had a first home visit who got that far? And I don't know what trimester they were in at the time of screen. So do you not have a birth date for TC? What piece of information are you missing that led this to be the case? All right, so that's it for the acceptance rate. We don't have as many factors anymore. It's shorter, but the ideas of how to read the report are the same as they were before. So let's go on to the retention rate report and first discuss the reporting time period with a couple of examples, since that actually tends to be the complex part about this report. So again, regarding one step, we're now looking at retention from the enrollment, the date of paperwork signing, or those with at least 1 home visit. If you sign the paperwork and never go to home visit, you're not included in this report. We want people who have at least 1 home visit log. So people who got some services, had a home visit, a real home visit, how long did they end up staying? How many of them made it to stay at least a year? Our reporting time period is usually the past 13 to 24 months. So let's say a little bit more about how we came up with that number. To figure out the reporting time period, I like to think of the key information and then work backwards. So here's what you need to know. You need to know the end of your reporting period. Maybe this is the end of your contract year. Maybe it's a calendar year or the end of a quarter or whatever someone else tells you the end of the reporting period needs to be. You need to figure out how long a retention period you want to look at. Do you care about who made it to a year of enrollment? Do you care about who made it to 6 months of enrollment? What's your period? And then how long an enrollment window do you want to look at? Are you looking across a year of time, how many people made it to 6 months of participation? Or are you saying, oh, of everyone who enrolled in a quarter, how many of them made it to a year? I changed something in this quarter and I really want to see what the specific impact of that was and see how it played out. But usually you're probably looking at a volume year. So the end of the reporting period, again, maybe it's the end of a contract year, maybe it's the end of a PI period. The retention period is going to determine the report end date. So someone who enrolled on the last day of the report, on the report end date, has to have been given a chance to have been retained for whatever retention period you pick. So again, with the working backwards piece, this is going to help you figure that out. The enrollment window is going to help you determine your report start date. So how far back are you going? How many months worth of participants are you looking at to figure out what their retention rate was? So your final report dates. So what you type into MIS, the end date is going to be the end of your reporting period minus the length of your retention period. And the start date is going to be the report end date minus the length of the enrollment window. So figure out your endpoints, work backwards from there. So let's see how this actually plays out. So let's say you wanted to take your 1 year retention as of basically now. It's May 9th. So we're going to say as of April 30th. So the end of the reporting period is April 30th. Cool. How long a retention period do we want to look at? Well, we've just said 1 year. All right. 1 year before April 30th, 2023 is April 30th, 2022. To have a chance of having been enrolled for 12 months as of April 30th, 2023, you need to have been enrolled and had a first home visit by April 30th, 2022, a year earlier. If you enrolled on the last day of the period, you need to have a chance of being retained for the full time. And we're going to look at a volume year for enrollment. So we go back another year to figure out the start point. All right, so another year back from 4/30/22 is 4/30/21 plus 1 day to make it a nice calendar year, so 5/1/21. So our final dates, what we're going to type into the MIS, 5/1/21 to 4/30/22. So this is the sort of working backwards. One more example. If we do 6-month retention, a 1 year period, ending 12/31/22. Let's go through the same questions. The end of the reporting period is 12/31/22. How long retention period do we want to look at? 6 months. Okay. What's 6 months? So what's 6 months before the end of my reporting period? What's the last date a person could enroll and have a chance of sticking around for at least 6 months? 6/30/22. All right. How long an enrollment window do we want to look at? We said a year. All right, a year earlier. So we're going to start 7/1/21 and end 6/30/22. Retention rate report is always operating at a lag. We're always going further back in time and seeing how that's played out into the future. This isn't a rapid cycling, look at the immediate impacts component, because we need to give people time to be retained for at least however long. We need to give them the chance. But that means that we have to work ourselves backwards from those pieces. I'm going to skip through this one last example. All right. So let's take a look at our report. Let's say we're looking at a year everyone enrolled from the first example, May 1st, 2021 through 4/30/2022. So they have a chance of being enrolled up to a year. All right. I want to note that the retention rate report excludes participants where the discharge reason was clearly unrelated to individual factors or was out of the program's control. So if participants were discharged because they were out of target region, if they moved, not like you could have done anything to retain them, if the pregnancy was terminated or if there was a miscarriage, if TC died, PC1 died, PC1 lost custody, they were transferred to another program, involved in another program, or safety issues. All of the families who have that one of those marked as their discharge reason are not included in the retention rate, whether they made it to a year or not, whether they were discharged after that year or not. We also want to note that the discharge date that we're using is backdated to the date of the last home visit. This is really how long were you retained and receiving services. So if you have a family who was getting home visits through December, and then you just could not get in touch with them, they kept canceling visits, they just weren't responding. Who knows, you put them on creative outreach, you're trying to get in touch with them, but they haven't been receiving visits since then. And then finally, April 1st, you're like, look, it's been 3 months of not being able to get in touch with them, and you discharge them. Their retention is actually going to be backdated to the end of December, to the date of their last home visit, because that's what the last time they actually received services. So you don't get those extra 3 months when they were on CO if they never come back and get another home visit, because they weren't actually getting services for those extra months. All right. Overall, for this report, we have 72 participants who were enrolled in this window. After 3 months, we'd lost 15 of them. So our retention rate is 79%. We have retained 57 out of 72. At 6 months, we've lost 5 more, so we've lost 20 total. So our retention rate is 72%. And at 1 year, we've lost a total of 32 people from the original cohort. So our retention rate is 56%. This is just over half. If this were what we used for the PIs, would this meet the PI item for retention rate? It would, because the PI target is 50%, and this is over 50% for 1 year retention. And so we have 40 families who are retained at the very end of this window. All right. So you can see here, we've got, again, the total discharge by the end of each interval. So this is cumulative. And then this other section is how many more were discharged in each interval. So this is additive, not cumulative. And then our overall retention rate at the 1 year mark, which is what we're focusing on here. All right, let's take a look at how our factors come into play. Age is our first factor. So we've got our initial sample breakdown, intake characteristics of all enrolled participants. So to start, our 20 up to 30-year-olds are our biggest chunk. And then the following columns are how many in each age group dropped out in that window, in that interval. Again, this is not cumulative. So this bottom section, interval by interval, for each couple of months segment is not cumulative. It's how many more people dropped out when. And at the very end, it's who's still retained. So I'll note that the gray percentages are percents of the gray numbers. That's how the color coding is working here. All right. So let's start at the end. Are there any differences in retention by age? So look at that retained at end. It's like, yes, we're retaining more older parents, fewer younger parents. The timing of that, we lose our under 18s pretty quick. Most of our under 18s are gone after 6 months. But we don't have very many under 18s to begin with, so maybe that's not the biggest piece to address. Our 20 up to 30-year-olds start as our biggest group, and are retained as our biggest group at the end. So at least there aren't huge differences in retention based on age, because our starting and our ending cohorts are not hugely dissimilar to each other. Our ending cohort is smaller, but it's not disproportionately smaller, or at least not massively so. All right, what about primary language? Most of our families to start are English speaking. But is there a difference in retention rate? Our 1-year retention is higher for Spanish-speaking families than for English-speaking families. So we're starting with more English-speaking families, but we're ending up keeping a higher percentage of Spanish-speaking families. We still have a higher number of English-speaking families, but we have a higher percentage of Spanish-speaking families that we're keeping. So that's a decent-sized group to potentially work on keeping. Why are English-speaking families dropping out at a higher rate than Spanish-speaking families? And a bunch of them dropping out pretty early on. What can you do to address that? Open question to ponder. And we've also got reasons for discharge. Of course, we don't have any reasons for discharge for those who are retained at the end. So that very last section of retained at end isn't included on this page of the report because they don't have any reasons for discharge. They're still retained. But what can we look at this and see? Well, the refused mostly drop out pretty early. Most of those who have refused as their discharge reason drop out pretty early. A couple of unable to locate also drop out pretty early. You've got a couple of families who are discharged for being unable to locate where that happens pretty early on. I don't know if that's typical for you, but it was a little surprising to me. Your non-compliant unresponsives, also one of our major frequent discharge reasons, are spread out through the window. Refuse new FSS, that was interesting. That discharge reason tends to come up later on. That's probably because people don't switch their FSSs super early on into their experience with healthy families, or at least hopefully they switch as infrequently as possible, but hopefully they've at least got the same worker for the first couple of months they're enrolled so they don't have a chance for that to be the issue. And then we have referral sources. Again, I'll note that our one referral, in this case from CPS, dropped out basically immediately within those first 3 months. So they were engaged, they enrolled, they had some home visits, or they had at least one home visit, and then they dropped out within the first 3 months. So again, referrals coming from CPS or from that domain, it's really important to be careful with those families and make sure they themselves want to engage in the program and not just that they feel like they have to, even though I'm sure that your staff has said this is a voluntary program. But again, it's a small number of people. This isn't something to make an entire plan around, but it is something to keep in mind. So the full retention rate report includes the following factors. We've got demographic, programmatic, social, and it can be run by worker as well, then reason for discharge and referral source. So this is a long report. It's got a lot in here. You should be able to find factors that matter to think about and make a plan about. All right, so these reports are great, but they are all formal information. And you still need that informal piece. No matter what else you do, you need informal. You need discussions with your staff. You need discussions with your advisory board. You need maybe surveys or contacts with parents who refuse or accept or drop out or stay enrolled, etc. This informal information can be in line with your formal findings. Maybe it'll give some further context to those findings or incorporate staff's perspective on why you might see those patterns. Or it can discuss a new factor. Again, if a factor is important to your community, but it isn't part of these reports, like we said, religion or locate or more specific location might be an important factor. That's just not part of these reports, but that you can learn about through informal data. All right, so you've got all your data, you've identified factors. Your plans need to address the factors you've identified in your analysis. It has to relate back to your analysis. You can't say, these are the factors that came up as an important in my analysis, and my plan is going to do this entirely other different thing. Okay, why are you doing that plan? Why are you not doing something that relates to everything else I talked about in your analysis? So just connect those two. Your factors should lead you to your plan. So for just the ratings, a 2, come up with a plan that addresses those factors. Does not yet have to be implemented. For 3, maybe you look back at last year's plan and say, well, this is what I did last year. How's it going? last year, I really wanted to update the engagement and the outreach and the program explanation that I did for families in this particular neighborhood who were a little bit further from my office and didn't know as much about us, but maybe we hired a staff member who lives in that area and so is part of the community, and we were hoping that would help engage those families better. Did you see a change? And a 1 rating is you didn't have a plan, it's not based on your analysis or doesn't connect to the factors you identified, or it doesn't address the important factors. So what would you do for a plan for your acceptance rate factors based on the data I showed before? So the factors that we looked at was that if people had adequate income, maybe if they were married, if they were English speaking, they were less likely to accept enrollment in your program. But if they had later and consistent prenatal care, they were at least 30, they were referred in from a home visiting program, they were more likely to accept. And then we had that referred from CPS, a small number, but they all enrolled and discharged before a home visit. What sort of plan could you make that would address at least some of these factors? It doesn't have to be all of them, but these are the factors you've identified. What seems to be the biggest one? How would you make a plan that would address it, that would then in the future increase your acceptance rate? And then for retention, again, some of the factors we looked at were really language, and then that discharge reason of unable to locate even early on. Is there something you could do to address those factors? And again, you can run this report by worker and see if different workers have really different patterns of retention for different families. What could you do about that? Could you maybe take that into account when you're matching families to workers? Is there something about assignment to just get better matches? Could you find a worker who's got a really strong retention rate and basically say, what do you do? And have everyone else try to learn from them or shadow them or work with them in order to support some of the other workers? Is it an older versus a more experienced veteran worker versus a newer, more junior, less experienced worker difference? So it's going to vary program by program. You know what's important for your program and for your community, what's going to work with your staff and with your families. But these are the sorts of things to think about. Thanks.